A nation can survive its fools, and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within.
They've been wrong about the wars. They've been wrong about jobs. They've been wrong about everything. The question is, are they stupid or do they have a plan? I actually think for the most part, they have a plan, but some are not too smart.
Welcome to the Horrible Deplorable Show, the anti-globalist America First program dedicated to dehoaxing the media and destroying the narrative. Here's your host, the founder and editor of the Daily Stir, Matt Wingard.
Welcome to the Horrible Deplorable Show. I'm Matt Wingard, and with me, usually as always, and back from her vacation is my good friend Doris. Hello, Doris.
Hello, Matt.
You can always find this episode and previous episodes of this show on your favorite podcasting app. So whether it's iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Pocket Cast, YouTube, look for us. And welcome to the Gab community. You can also hear us playing pretty regularly now, even during the week, but randomly, on the405media.com. We do play on Saturday and Sundays at 5 p.m., but sometimes you can hear us during the week on the405media.com. If you have any questions or issues that you'd like us to address on the show, please don't hesitate to email me at mattmwingard@gmail.com. That's mattmwingard@gmail.com. Doris has been in Mexico for the last 2 weeks. We can reveal that now because she's back safely. Doris, did you have a good time?
I did have a good time. The weather was between 60 and 74 degrees most of the time, so it didn't help my tan a lot, but we had about 15 people there in our group, and it was a lot of fun. For people that have never been to Cancun, it is that area of Mexico up on the tip, almost straight down from Miami. Many years ago, the Mexican government looked for the best place in Mexico for tourists, and they picked Cancun because of its climate without too many bugs and because of its beautiful beaches. The only thing with Cancun is if you expect a Mexican experience there, forget it. It's like going to Hawaii in Mexico. But anyway, it's a great place to visit and very safe.
You've been going pretty regularly for some years with a timeshare. Was this your last trip to Mexico?
Right. After 25 years, this was my last trip. We had purchased a timeshare, and this is now over with, and we will get our original money back that we used to purchase the timeshare.
So now you have to pick a new destination on the planet to go to every December.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking I haven't done the European cruise yet.
Yeah, I like that idea very much. Take a friend. Okay, tax cuts passed, and that's a big deal. They were celebrating yesterday at the White House, and that was a pretty good video of that whole backslapping congratulatory celebration. I encourage you to go watch it if you haven't already, because it does explain, based on who he thanks and who's brought up and what they all say, you can kind of see how the deal was purchased, because that's what happens in Congress, is you have to horse trade to get things from people. It does simplify the code. The corporate rate is brought down to 21%. Looks like small business owners will be able to, these are S-Corps, will be able to deduct the first 20% up to somewhere around $300,000. Withholding adjustments will start probably in February, so most people will see a slightly larger paycheck or less withholding starting in February. So that's a nice instant paycheck bump for people. Everyone with kids gets a larger deduction. The Obamacare mandate was repealed. Also, quite interestingly, the bill punishes blue states. It was a rare opportunity to single them out because none of the Democrats wanted to be involved in negotiations, and they were all going to be solid no's on the bill. So what they've done is to basically largely eliminate the deduction that high-income earners get for their state and local taxes off of their federal taxes. The way this impacts blue states is that by allowing them to deduct that, essentially blue states have been able to raise taxes quite high, and then people can deduct that off their federal taxes. So they've transferred their budgetary needs onto the rest of us. Now, in order to retain high-income earners in their state, they're going to have to lower taxes and cut their own budgets, or high-income earners are going to begin to relocate outside of blue states. It's one or the other, because people aren't just going to sit there and be taxed at such a high rate. So it's putting some tremendous pressure on blue states. I had seen yesterday that New York Governor Cuomo was very angry because he had planned to cut state taxes next year and wanted the glory of that. And now he's going to, he's faced with the prospect of having to do that in response to lowering the budget. He's not going to be able just to cut taxes free and clear. He's going to have to bring budgets down as well. So that's going to put a lot of pressure on him. There was a reason why there were some Republicans that voted no in the House, and that's because they came from blue states, and it's going to hurt some of their own folks. And I think you can expect that some Republican seats in blue states will be lost as a result of this. But the trick to that is just to make sure that we pick up some Republican seats in red states that are currently held by Democrats, which is possible. And that's just part of the politics of how this all works. There was also a provision in there capping the salaries for nonprofit employees at $1 million. That's going to affect a lot of hospitals who pay and compensate high-level executives way above the $1 million point. I actually think that cap should come way down, but it's a nice start to actually place a cap on nonprofit salaries. Another one put in there to get Lisa Murkowski's vote for the tax bill was ANWR drilling, something that Republicans have been talking about for nearly 30 years, and bingo, bango, bongo, there it is, right there in the bill that passed and is going to be signed by the president. Suddenly, we're going to be able to drill in ANWR, which is all part of the president's agenda to try to further America's energy independence, so good for them.
There was a reaction on the tax cuts from AT&T. Now keep in mind, AT&T needs the administration's support for its merger with Time Warner, but it is offering $1,000 bonuses to its 200,000 employees and also investing $1 billion in the U.S. after the tax cuts become law. Others, including Boeing and Wells Fargo, have announced similar actions.
Yes, so the Democrats, of course, wanted everybody to believe the sky was falling. That's not what happened, and, they've managed to pour so much crap on this bill that it pulls very low right now. But I think GOP leaders are correct that, if the economy continues to improve and if people see that paycheck bounce in February and when people file in April, a lot of people are going to see an increased child tax credit and the rest. People are going to feel the positive effects of the tax cuts, and opinion on it is going to skyrocket on the positive side. It's very, very helpful going into the November elections. But as I've said before, I don't believe that the tax cut alone is enough to close the enthusiasm gap for Republicans going into that election. Talk about that in a second. I do want to point out that Never Trump is chewing glass right now because every prediction they've made about Trump being impeached, him being a failure, the stock market's going to crash. We're going to deal with Trump's 1 year in office. I know a lot of people are going to do it in December. I'm likely to do it in January, although we may address it next week because technically he wasn't sworn into office until January, so he has a few more weeks to rack up some more wins before we actually should be doing a 1 year anniversary review, but he's doing quite well. Those of you who remember the 6-month review that I did can expect that a number of grades are going to be going up for the annual review, as I suspected they would. They just needed a little bit more time to get people in place and to get some accomplishments racked up. I will say that, as Never Trump chews glass and spits nails and does all the rest, those of you in your own state parties ought to be looking around and doing an assessment of who the Never Trumpers are in your own organizations. One of the great gifts that Trump gave us was so many people in politics hide who they really are. And if they're saboteurs or if they're just in it for themselves, you often don't know that because they can do a good job of giving speeches or voting carefully in certain directions at certain times so that you're not totally aware of what their nefarious intentions are. But Trump comes along and he got everybody to take a side. Nobody sat on the sidelines. And so the Never Trumpers all identified themselves. All of these Queensberry's rules people within our own midst who are Washington Generals players, people who either are paid losers, who are in it for the money and the prestige and other things, and ultimately they're going to roll out to some K Street lobby job or they're going to go do something else afterwards, but they understand that their job is to essentially play against the Democrats and lose. Those people were all identified for us. And then the handkerchief Republicans as well. All the people who believe that it's only worth winning if you can win in a certain way, and that you have to have the moral high ground against the Democrats. And so, of course, they think that Trump is a pig. And so if this is the way that we have to win, then they'd rather lose with dignity. All those people identified themselves too. And if you paid attention within your own state parties, you now know who those people are. People who were unwilling to support the president when he became the nominee in 2016, and who were never Trumpers through the general election because they believed he wasn't going to win, and they didn't think there were going to be any consequences. They were just getting ready for Trump to lose in that November election so that they could then go around and purge all of the people who had supported Trump. Well, I'm sorry to say, but those people have to be purged themselves. I wish that it was possible for there to be a kumbaya moment, and a few people did make their peace with it and come back. But for the most part, I don't think you can trust those people ever again. People who wouldn't support the Republican nominee, people who are officials in your own party who would not support the Republican nominee in the general election, they have to go. Those people temporarily outed themselves as people who are not team players and who are not in it to win. They have other motives. And if you give them enough time, they're going to recede back into the background again. They're going to find their rock to go back under, and eventually here they're going to try to pretend that they've always been a Trump supporter. And you have a rare window of opportunity to get those people out of the way and replace them with people who are willing to do what it takes to win. Because if you're not winning elections, then your principles don't really matter much. Think of all the people throughout history who had principles and then lost on the battlefield. I'm talking about real battlefields. It doesn't matter what you stood for. If you lose on the battlefield, you are wiped away and the victors come in. And it's their religion and their philosophy and their lifestyle and their social norms, whatever. They're the ones who write the history books and decide how everyone lives. And, you know, if you followed me on this podcast, I think politics is war without weapons. And the point is that if you're not winning elections, then it does not matter what you stand for. And it's one of the points that Ann Coulter tries to make about immigration and why immigration has to be the number one issue. Because if you aren't winning on the issue of immigration, if you're allowing the Democrats to literally import a different voting base so that they can beat you, and she points to California correctly as where the whole country will go if you let mass immigration take hold, then it doesn't matter if your most important issue is abortion, or if your most important issue is tax cuts, or if your most important issue is the deficit. None of that matters because you're not going to win any elections. And that's why immigration has to be the number one issue. And that's why I'm telling you, take these gifts that Trump has given you, identifying all the local officials in your party who could not get on board for a candidate that could get it done and who could win, and get those people out of positions of authority while you still have time to do that before the next election. I also would issue a warning here going forward into 2018 about the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the GOP members who are heavily tied to the Chamber of Commerce. I've said for some time on this podcast that, there are people in the party who are with Trump, and they're both conservatives and nationalists, and they support both sides of his coalition. And then there are people in the party who are basically just conservatives, and they don't like the nationalist part of Trump's agenda. And I've been warning for the last year that what a lot of never-Trumpers and folks in the GOP have been trying to do is to stifle the nationalist agenda, to delay it while they support the conservative agenda, because they want that stuff. They want conservative judges like Gorsuch, and they want the tax cuts. But my warning now is that they've gotten that, folks. And this year, they've managed to delay a lot of the nationalist agenda. We haven't seen tremendous progress on the immigration front. Where's the wall? Where's the massive deportations that we were promised? And we haven't seen a lot of action so far. I mean, there's been some movement on trade deals, but we haven't seen any big announcements on big changes to any of NAFTA or WTO. So in my mind, that is exactly what's happened, is a lot of the nationalist agenda has been slowed or delayed, and the conservative agenda has been advanced to some degree. So now that the chamber and those folks have the tax cuts, my concern is, what's their objective next year? On balance now, as things begin to turn to the nationalist agenda, because they've gotten most of what they want on the conservative agenda, what's in their interest in the next year going into the election? Now, they may somewhat still support the agenda, but is it in their interest now for the Democrats to take the House in November Because, of course, that doesn't mean the Democrats are going to get their way. It means that things are going to grind to a halt. The Democrats get the House and Republicans retain the Senate, and the president serves, obviously, another 2 years or more. That essentially means his nationalist agenda is dead. And it also, because the Democrats can stop it in the House, but it also means that the conservative agenda doesn't necessarily go as far forward. But if you've gotten the highlights, if you got a Supreme Court justice and you got the tax cuts, you have an incentive now, if you're a never-Trumper, to not necessarily be fully on board with the GOP and to not necessarily want full control of the government to remain in the hands of Republicans. And my concern going forward here is what does the U.S. Chamber and the never-Trumper folks, what do they do? What's in their interest next year? Are they really going to help us retain full control of the government, or do they kind of secretly not want that at this point? They got theirs, and they're not as interested in us getting ours. So be wary. And we're going to get a big test of that next month, because there's going to be a push for some kind of DACA compromise in Congress. Now let's go over where I am on this. I have always said that everything is negotiable. You must be willing to sit down and negotiate. My problem with Republicans, as I've said time and time again, is they make lousy deals. In my mind, a good deal is an even deal where both sides are getting significant concessions. The problem with Republican deals in the past is they've always given Democrats long-term gains in exchange for short-term gains for Republicans, and it's never made political sense to me. Now, I assumed for many years that it was because Republicans were bad negotiators. Trump, of course, with his campaign and his presidency and his outing of Never Trump and all of that, he has exposed the truth of it, which is that these were purposeful deals, and that a lot of these Republicans lose on purpose because they have other selfish motives for what they're getting out of politics. So, in theory, I'm not opposed to the idea of a DACA deal. My argument has always been that the president has the advantage right now because he has the executive. So he has the ability to keep deporting, to change the playing field every day, which puts pressure on Democrats to make a deal. And DACA is the only legislative leverage that we have in this negotiation. Once we give anything on DACA, once that issue is settled one way or another, then there's no other leverage point in negotiations that we have with Democrats to form any kind of deal. So my argument is this is your one tool. Use it wisely. In other words, get everything that you want to get, because if you only get some of what you want and then you give away in some fashion a DACA amnesty or some path to citizenship, and don't worry, no matter what they say, it's always a path to citizenship. If you give people legal status, they will eventually become citizens. The political pressure never stops. They will eventually become citizens. If you make a deal, and once the Democrats have that, they'll never sit down and negotiate with you again. So whatever you leave off the table is off.
So my question is, if you were making the deal, what would you exchange?
So I would drive a hard bargain because I'm not afraid to walk away. Again, the walk away position is we're just going to keep deporting. And this is why I wanted the president to ratchet up his deportations. He needs to be increasing deportations constantly because that creates pressure on the Democrats to come and negotiate. So assuming that I'm willing to walk away, then I ask for everything that I want. You want the RAISE Act, so that you change from, allowing all of the poor to pour in, P-O-O-R, to P-O-U-R-N. You want to change this to a point system like Canada and New Zealand and other places have, and that's this end to chain migration. But I also want an end to anchor babies. I want that addressed. And even if the Democrats claim in a negotiation that the Supreme Court decided that, they did not. It was in a footnote. It has not really officially been addressed by the U.S. Supreme Court. My argument is, let's put language in the bill. You guys can sue and take it to the U.S. Supreme Court, but then we will force the Supreme Court to make a decision. Now, the Democrats aren't going to be excited about that because of the makeup of the Supreme Court right now, and once a decision comes down, it's pretty final. But I say force language into the bill clearly defining what it means to be within the boundaries of the United States, and force them to take the issue to the Supreme Court so that it can get settled. So you've got to have anchor babies dressed in there. You have to end chain migration. You get E-Verify. You get funding for the wall. Now, see, of course, this is a huge list. You're basically saying, look, I want a complete change and a reduction of overall even legal immigration to the United States. And then even then, that's not enough for me. I don't want to let all of the DACAs in. In exchange for, I would put a hard cap on something like, I like the number 1 million. Allow 1 million of the best, and you set a whole bunch of standards of college education or not taking welfare. You have a whole list of things, no criminal record, obviously. People who serve in the military can rise to the top of the list, but you cap it at 1 million. Something around that negotiated number. So you know you're not going to get any of their relatives, and you know you're not going to get a bunch of people flooding in you didn't know about suddenly, and so you give some kind of DACA amnesty and it turns into 3 million or 5 million. No, you cap it at a specific number. Now, I think this is a totally unpalatable deal that the Democrats will not take. Fine. Then you walk away and you go back to deporting. And within a couple more months, DACA expires and you begin deporting the DACA students as well. And most of them are adults. That's it. That's the deal I'd make. And because I'm willing to walk away. And the Democrats either want it or they don't want it. Period. Would I move a little bit on that 1 million number? Probably in a negotiation. To get all of the things I've listed? Absolutely. The point is, we know hard and fast what the number is going to be at the end of the day, and that's it. Now, having said all of that, the people who are going to sit down and negotiate for us on our side are not me, okay? They are not going to take that hard line. And so what you're going to see in January is a much softer deal. Some pieces of what I've just listed, but not all of them, and probably a much more generous amnesty to the DACA students. And that's why I've said before in this podcast, I'm not opposed to making a deal, but I 99.9% guarantee you that the deal that these people like Lindsey Graham, who are not on our side, are going to make in January is going to be a bad deal. So we had to be prepared to mobilize and to push against it and to make it clear to the president that it is not okay. We do not want this deal. And we have to make our voices loud and clear. Look, I think the president's inclined to make a deal, but he does watch Twitter. He watches social media. He watches his base. He takes calls from Steve Bannon. If he is concerned enough that he will lose that 25% of this country that backs him solidly, the people who've been there through the primary and everything, if he thinks he's putting those people in jeopardy of him losing them, he won't make the deal. So we have to just be very, very loud and vocal and be against this deal. Now, look, if I'm wrong and they make some kind of great deal, I'll say it on this podcast. But when I say there's a 99.9% chance they won't, that's how confident I am that this is going to be a crappy deal. And I say that because the deal that I would make, I am absolutely convinced that Democrats will not make. They won't agree to that deal. So any deal that they're willing to agree to, is going to be a bad deal. And first of all, any deal that Lindsey Graham is negotiating for on our side, is going to be a bad deal. So we have to be ready to be extremely loud and vocal with the president next month to bring these negotiations to a fruitless end. So the DOJ FBI scandal increases. And, the reason you don't see as much about it and why it gets downplayed, it's just amazing to me the way the mainstream media goes into action to actually try to knock down the facts that have been coming out about this. Trying to make excuses for these tweets about we need insurance against Trump winning. I mean, can you imagine an equivalent type of email coming out against Obama, or there being some hint of people trying to thwart the election of the first black president of the United States? I mean, we already know the other side's more violent and they're much more willing to take to the streets. But think of I would submit to you that if it had come out that people in the government had actively, in the Bush administration, had actively tried to sabotage the election of Barack Obama, there would have been urban riots on the scale that we're used to seeing, in the past, and cities burning. So, the media's out there hoaxing, trying to do what they can to distract. I saw that someone on social media said that they searched the Washington Post site for mention of this guy's stroke and insurance policy. And on the Washington Post, they got one hit, one story, and it was a guest opinion from Andrew McCarthy over at National Review. That was the only hit in the Washington Post. And the New York Times, nothing. Zero coverage of the most significant scandal to come out of all of these investigations in the last year. What have we learned? We've learned that this whole thing was projection. if we dial it back to last year when they came up with this Russia collusion story, the big sell on this has been from our side is that, this was just their way of explaining why Hillary lost. No, I think it was more nefarious than that. I believe that they looked around and understood now that with President Trump, who was a complete shock, they believed there was zero chance he was going to get elected the night before. And so last November, when he won, I think a lot of people had an oh crap moment where they realized that, it was his people that were going to come into the DOJ and the FBI and all the executive branches, and that they would find out what they had done. All of this collusion and work, the dossier that had been delivered to them by McCain's people and that Clinton had paid for, and that we now know key members of the FBI and DOJ were meeting with Fusion GPS. This is high-level, illegal, felonious stuff. It's illegal. It's very, very illegal, and they knew it, and they had assumed that Hillary would win and that the same people would stay in positions of power, or if they were replaced by other Democrats, that the cover-up would continue. We would never have seen any of these emails. Think about that. How corrupt our government would be right now a year into the Hillary Clinton administration, and the things that we wouldn't know, okay? And they understood on election night and the next day that this stuff was going to come out, that inevitably it was going to come out. So, one of the things we know they did is they delayed and delayed because we didn't find out until just recently. So they were able to push it out a year. But these are clever knife fighters. These communists, I'm telling you, folks, they really know how to play politics. And they understood that they had a window here before this stuff came out. And that if it all came out naked, in other words, if this was the only scandal and it came out, they would be crushed in the next elections. When the Watergate stuff rolled out in 1972 and 1973, and then Nixon was forced out, the entire Republican Party took a hit in the 74 elections. They were crushed in the House. This was the big wave of far lefties that came into Congress that cut off all the aid to South Vietnam and caused Saigon to fall and all of that. This was all a result of Americans, at least the people in the middle who aren't that political, being completely disgusted by what they saw from the Nixon administration or what they were told by the media had happened, and them believing that the Republican Party was tainted by this and turning in mass to Democrats, or there being an enthusiasm gap and a lot of Republicans just not turning out to vote in the 74 election. Democrat operatives understood a year ago that if this reality of what they had done during the election came out, that they would be crushed in the 2018 election. And so they knew they had a window. What do you do with that window? Well, if you're smart, if you're the James Carville types, very nefarious but very clever folks, you realize we need some kind of scandal on the Republican side. We have to push with all of our different media organs a scandal, an epic scandal on the Republican side, and create enough smoke that voters think there's some heat there. And it doesn't matter if it's debunked, because once you put enough smoke out there, once you publish enough articles, people never believe it's totally debunked. You just get it out there in the bloodstream and people just think, well, there was something. There was, something happened. They knew they needed to put enough smoke out there so that when their scandal came out, it just looked like a lot of people in both parties were doing nefarious stuff. So what to do? The Russian collusion story, right? If we claim that President Trump was involved in colluding with the Russians, that it has a double-fold goodness to it. One is it's kind of similar to our scandal because actually our side was involved in collusion with the Russians in a number of different ways. So we need it to be sort of a similar scandal of thwarting the election and being involved with the Russians, right? That's what they were guilty of. So we'll find this Russian collusion story of Trump is perfect because it's sort of similar to our actual scandal. And a lot of people will believe it because they don't want to believe that he just won fair and square. So then you just saw all of these organs, all these media organs go to work to push this story, which has zero credibility. There is no evidence to back it up whatsoever. But enough smoke, enough of this crap being put out there for 12 months, and there is this feeling out there among John Q. public, well, something happened. Something happened. And now, finally, the Democrat scandal is exposed, and it comes flooding out. And, of course, they're doing everything they can to tamp it down. But it has accomplished its goal. If you talk to the average voter right now, they'll say, well, I think that, maybe the Democrats were doing something nefarious, but the Republicans were doing something nefarious, so a pox on both their houses. They're all just kind of tainted. I don't know what to make of it all. Perfect. It's just brilliant. It's just brilliant on the part of Democrats. They have executed their plan flawlessly. It's a rear guard action designed to cover the retreat of their troops, and it has worked. And it is working. But this is a huge scandal, folks. It's much bigger than Watergate. And I'm telling you that if people do not go to jail for this, I said this about Obama in the past, that people say, that all the things that he did were illegal and that thank God Trump's elected, it's never going to happen again. And I wrote an op-ed about this. You can go to thedailystir.com and search for it and find it. But look, when presidents do things, when they assume powers and no one is prosecuted, and it is not stopped, that becomes the new norm. That's the new norm. It will happen again. Now, there may be a Republican that comes in and chooses not to do that during their administration, but when the next Democrat is elected, they will go right back to doing that. Because if people don't go to jail, even if you think it's unconstitutional, even if you think it's illegal, if the president does it and gets away with it, that's the new norm. And my argument here is that if people do not go to jail for this active subversion of the democratic process, then you're going to see it again. Whether or not we ever find out about it, it will happen again, and both parties will engage in it. Look, if one party is able to try to subvert the election and no one goes to jail, if you don't think people on the Republican side aren't going to basically say, look, if those are the new rules, then we're going to play by them too because it's the only way to win, that's what's going to happen. So my argument is that this is the kind of stuff that furthers the end of the republic. If people do not go to jail for this activity, then this activity is going to happen again. Both sides, it just will. And that's why it's extremely important that this not be let go. This is why Jeff Sessions and Deputy Rosenstein, people have to be prosecuted for this. They must frog march people. You make a big public spectacle of this. You get people convicted because it's a statement that we will not tolerate this. And if we do tolerate this, and I realize that you and I aren't tolerating this, but what I mean is as a society, if we tolerate this, if people aren't put in jail, then it will happen again as the sun rises every morning. Take it to the bank. The last thing I'll say on this, folks, is that the Democrats and the mainstream media people you see pushing the Trump collusion story, they know it's false. They know it. So every time you see them reporting on this or you see some article, remind yourself that the people who wrote it actually know the story is false. They know it. And they are keeping it alive purposefully. These are low, despicable people. And they do not want what's best for you, your family, or this country.
So let's talk about the FBI. Yesterday, a federal judge declared a mistrial in the prosecution of Nevada cattleman Clive Bundy, his 2 sons, and a co-defendant. They cited the government's willful failure to turn over documents that could help the defense fight the conspiracy and assault charges. The judge listed 6 types of evidence she found prosecutors deliberately withheld before the trial. Now, of course, will these people be retried? The judge will decide by January 8th whether or not there will be a new trial. But putting Washington politics aside, here is yet another example of the misused power of FBI leaders.
Well, I know the BLM was heavily involved in this. They were the lead agency. This is a huge screw up. All of this came around the Bundys and their cattle on BLM land and everything. And look, this is going to affect Ryan Zinke's grade with me, the Secretary of Interior. I think these folks need to be cleared out. There are a lot of bad eggs in these interior departments who basically kind of get their rocks off of oppressing rural people and acting like environmental warriors, and they need to be pushed out of these agencies. Retire them or give them that basement job with a phone that's not plugged in.
Instead of people from the BLM baiting people to get them to act in a bad manner, so then the FBI sweeps in and makes the matter even worse. It's
an ugly, ugly business. If you haven't taken time to learn the Bundy story, go and do that. It's very similar to the Oregon standoff story, and these are basically federal agencies and prosecutors run amok. I have to say that I think the public's getting a real lesson in prosecutorial overreach. You have what's happened to Mike Flynn, which doesn't look particularly reasonable to people who are watching the Mueller investigation. Some of us are old enough to remember what happened to the Vice President Cheney's chief of staff, Scooter Libby, and he was also prosecuted for lying to the FBI, and that always felt like an overreach. I still hope that at some point President Trump will pardon Scooter Libby and erase that conviction that he has carried around. But you have the Oregon standoff, and there have been previous ones at places like Ruby Ridge, and certainly what happened with the Bundys. Now, I'm not going to get into the character of some of the people involved in some of the older stuff, but it is constantly, we see one example after another of rural people interacting with the government who basically act like jackbooted thugs and push them around. And it's because rural people are a minority in this country. Everybody likes to focus on blacks or Hispanics or what have you, but rural people have no political power in the United States because only 3% of people are involved in agriculture in this country. Most people live in the urban or suburban areas, and most rural people are at the mercy of the urban areas in their state. So even at their state capital, they don't really have a lot of power because they're simply outvoted. And so they live as sort of, in a kind of a quasi-serf status in the United States now, where all of these urban and suburban voters decide on these animal rights issues and national lands issues, stuff that they don't live anywhere near. And so it's all the way that rural people have to live with these rules that people far away are making. And there are a lot of East Coast Republicans that are involved in this too. East Coast Republicans in Congress are famous for taking these kinds of nasty anti-rural people votes, which they chalk up as environmental votes, basically for their own crass political reasons. I know when I worked for Congressman Hastings in Central Washington that he would complain that his own members would vote for stuff that was bad for the Western United States. And when he would confront them about it, they would say, look, I have to run in these suburban, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and this is a free green vote for me. It's happening thousands of miles away, and I get to run as, very environmentalist. It helps me with a lot of suburban soccer moms and the rest. And so there are a lot of Republicans that sell us out on things like school choice and environmental issues because they represent very good neighborhoods far away from rural areas. So it's a free green vote, or they don't need school choice because they have fantastic school districts or what have you. So there are a lot of problems internally that lead to this. It isn't just Democrats, acting as communists or hyperventilating about environmental issues one way or the other. So the Me Too hysteria continues. We checked in when it reached peak 10, and then I believe it went to 11, and it's sort of holding pretty steady at 11. I saw that T.J. Miller, who was on the show Silicon Valley, there's some story, I think it was in the Daily Beast, about a woman telling a story about how he choked and slapped her during sex when they were in college. And so this became a big story in the Daily Beast about this relationship he had with this woman back in college. And of course, they kept her completely anonymous in the story. I do not believe that when people are making accusations that will damage a person's reputation, I don't care if people are famous or if they're public officials, this career-ending stuff. You cannot get the taint. It doesn't matter that you're never going to get your day in court or that you're presumed innocent. When these accusations are made, they live on the internet forever. T.J. Miller is never going to get rid of that Daily Beast article. It will always be there as if it's yesterday, this accusation. He'll be an 80-year-old man, and it will be out there constantly that he was accused of this in college, right? So this stuff exists forever, and you should not be able to come forward and make these accusations in print and remain anonymous. That's ridiculous. And this kind of throws back to an older time when the press, I think, it was, a chivalrous move that somehow a woman who was raped or taken advantage of, that this kind of was a soil on her reputation or what have you. I mean, no one in the modern feminist community believes that a woman's sexual choices are any mark against her now, right? That's the world we live in. So this doesn't prevent her from being able to get married or find her Prince Charming. No one's tainted by their sexual past anymore. So Why do identities have to be protected? These are very serious charges. You know, if a woman came forward and claimed that so-and-so, that TJ Miller murdered somebody, no one would give her anonymity in that article. If she was going to accuse him of murder, she would have to put her name to it. Bank robbery. I mean, think of all the vicious crimes that if you accuse somebody of, you have to be public about it. The news media is not going to protect your identity. But they've created this kind of closed loop around certain sexual crimes that they will provide anonymity for. And I don't believe it makes any sense. If it did at one time, and that's arguable, it certainly does not today. If you're going to make these kinds of charges, and I don't know whether it's true or not, my argument is that if you're going to make such a serious charge, you got to do it in public and you got to put your name to it so that the public can hold you accountable if it's not true. And in some cases, we find out they aren't true. We had this story down under, I think in Australia, of this kid who was facing a lifetime in jail for this girl had accused him of rape. And then it turned out prosecutorial misconduct. They had been withholding all of her emails in which basically the emails exonerated him and showed that she'd been in a consensual relationship with him the whole time. And once the judge found out, threw the whole thing out. But this kid was very close, and he'd been in jail for some period of time. He was very close to being put away forever on this woman's word. Now, she has remained anonymous throughout this whole process, even now that we know she's a liar. Even in the story the media did, in which they were clearly convinced that she had lied and that he was now free, they still didn't name her. So she gets to make this accusation, almost get away with it, and walk away, and there's no, her name is not on the internet forever. Scot-free, no consequences.
No taint on her name.
And meanwhile, he is now freed from jail, but the accusations are still out there. Sure, you can claim that there are articles that exonerate him, but the charges and all the things she claimed, they still sit out there on the internet forever with his name tied to them. This is just not right. Not right at all. And this practice of withholding names of accusers has got to stop.
There's been a lot of quickness to crucify men in Hollywood. And while many of these accusations may be true, what about the women's participation? Some of the would-be starlets actually signed the bottom of their photographs with the initials DDR, Director Rights Respected, which included trading sex for a movie role.
This was something Ian McKellen, I think, was just quoted recently as saying he's an older man, but he says back in his time that was a pretty common practice for some women. I do think that it's quite interesting in this whole hysteria that, these stories, I'm just baffled by some of these stories. I mean, look, you have to separate some of these are stories about men being very physically aggressive and attacking women, and I think that you can get near unanimity on condemning that stuff. But I've been reading these stories as it's been going on, and some of these stories are women that are claiming rape who never actually told the person they're accusing that they didn't want to have sex with them. This is one story that involves Russell Simmons, of this woman who he takes her home to his place, and she walks with him into the elevator, goes all the way up to his room, goes into his bedroom, and then, he has sex with her, according to her, all unwilling. She's now claiming that this is a rape story, but when you read it, she never physically tries to stop it at any point. She doesn't have to be dragged out of the car. She doesn't have to be dragged into the elevator. She didn't have to be dragged into his room. And now she's claiming the whole time that she's feeling intimidated by him and his bodyguard, and she didn't feel like she had another choice. But again, when you read the story, everything she's claiming was in her head. If you had actually been there, watching the whole thing, you might never have known that she didn't want to have sex with Russell Simmons, because everything that she claims happened in her story happened inside her skull. And I'm thinking, at some point, doesn't feminism have to advocate for a woman's agency? Doesn't she have to put up some kind of a fight? Doesn't she have to resist in some way so that an outside observer would know that this woman is in distress? And how is this good for feminism? When, you have some of these women who are claiming that someone showed them porn or told an off-color joke. There's this one woman who's accusing a liberal judge, Kaczynski, who I don't like at all. The fact that this man's retiring doesn't bother me at all. But one of his accusers is telling a story about how he showed her porn once when she was an assistant there. And that basically she never went on to become a judge, and she instead dropped out of the law profession and she writes romance novels. She's never stopped thinking about this 20 years later. And I'm thinking, I mean, I get it. You didn't want to be showed porn, but really? I mean, that was such a scarring event as a 19 or 20-year-old woman that you never recovered and you never fulfilled your legal dreams and you had to go do something else. I don't know that this is a good argument for feminism. That, there's no resilience in there whatsoever, that somebody can't take a negative. It's not like she got hit by a car and run over and was in physical therapy for 5 years trying to learn to walk again. I mean, some of these stories just have me wondering, in what way is this an argument that women are just the same as men, that they can handle the rough and tumble of a society and the ups and downs of the business world and the fact that bad things happen when you interact with other human beings? Again, I'm separating out the stuff where people are physically attacked from these stories, which are really baffling, where these are dialogues women were having in their head that they were not sharing with the man they're accusing in the story, or that they, some that got told a lewd joke and they never recovered from that. What? I mean, feminism pushed back on this idea that women had to be kept at home and that they were delicate flowers, and that there was this need, this chivalrous need to protect women. And that was rejected by feminism as, how dare you treat us like China porcelain dolls. And yet you read some of these stories, and it's women who are basically saying, I was a China porcelain doll and he broke me. It's baffling. So overnight, the president issued his first clemency to this, I believe, devout Jew, maybe Hasidic, it's a form of Judaism that's obviously very orthodox. His name was Shalom Rubashkin. I'm not sure how that's pronounced. He was convicted of bank fraud. He runs some kosher outfit in Iowa. Sentenced to 27 years. He served 8 of them, 10 children. And Trump has commuted the sentence. Now, it's not a pardon. He still maintains the conviction, but he essentially let him out of jail. Spontaneous demonstration, positive celebrations among the Orthodox Jewish community in New York. Out on the streets, I saw videos of this on social media. His first clemency was for a Jewish person, right? The big racist anti-Semite Trump, right? First clemency. And the Jews are very happy. And the mainstream media, boy, they just had zero interest in this story. I mean, I have seen so little coverage of this in the last 24 hours. Coming on the heels of the tax cut bill, the media is not happy with, they're having the no good, terrible year, not Trump. So let's talk about Star Wars, The Last Jedi, which Doris and I saw.
And before Matt tells you all the reasons or his opinions, let me say that I enjoyed the movie.
That's it?
That's it.
Why did you enjoy the movie, Doris? Because I am going to tear into it, folks.
Oh, I thought the acting was pretty good. I like the special effects, and I don't read a lot into the stories like Matt does.
Doris is a good example of somebody who just loves to have the liberal commanding heights pour all their gooey, juicy goodness down on top of her, unaffected. But I can't do it, folks, and I'm here to tell you the truth. I've made this argument before that if you think these people in Hollywood just write stuff like, they just wake up in the middle of the night and pump out a script, and that it comes while they're sleepwalking, and that there's no subtext, and they don't have any agenda, you're kidding yourself. You've seen them on their Twitter accounts and in these interviews. You know how leftist they are. And their art is their politics. And they are going to push their agenda through their art. That's just what they're going to do. It's just going to happen. So I saw this on Sunday and then again on Tuesday. And part of it was I saw it with a friend, and then I knew Doris wanted to see it again, so we went again on Tuesday. But I also needed a second look at it because I was really angry at this movie, and I needed to see it again to solidify and crystallize my thoughts about why this movie is so bothersome. So it is a social justice warrior fest, and Rian Johnson, who wrote and directed it, is entirely responsible for this. This... The trilogy of 1, 2, and 3 that Lucas did back in the 90s, or it was the aughts, I guess it was the aughts, it was bad, okay? Those were bad movies, but it wasn't as much of a social justice warrior fest as these. So I would argue that while I happen to like the one that came out a couple years ago, and again, I'm going to leave Rogue One, the standalone movie, out of this. I actually think that's a pretty good movie. It's kind of a remake of The Dirty Dozen. It's fine on its own. And the Force Awakenings wasn't a bad movie. It was fine. It's just a repeat of A New Hope. But this is entirely Rian Johnson's take in this second part of this trilogy, and he has definitely taken a leftward tilt on this franchise, which I hope course corrects because it's a totally new and different person doing the third and final one, so maybe it'll get back on track. But this one was pretty bad. Look, this guy does not like Star Wars. That's real clear because he's basically crapping on every element of the Star Wars franchise. I mean, there's a moment where Luke Skywalker's handed, I'm going to try not to do too many spoilers here, folks, but I mean, there's a moment early on where Luke is handed the lightsaber and he chucks it over his shoulders. And that is essentially repeated throughout the whole film. All the kind of basic tenets that the Jedis are good, that they're important, that they serve a purpose, nope. I mean, there's a bunch of dialogue that's a bunch of crap. And everything that makes Star Wars what it is, there's some moment in the film where somebody does or says something that basically says, no, that's crap. And all the men in the story are flawed. Every single male character is flawed, and all the women are pillars of strength. Even the bad women in the story are pillars of strength. This trilogy is very anti-male so far. I think another reason why the movie doesn't work, because it got me to think about why did the original set back in the 70s and 80s, episodes 4, 5, and 6, why did those work? And definitely, what they do better than any of the others is really involve us in the characters, right? I mean, we came to care about Luke Skywalker and Leia and Han Solo because they spent a lot of time developing those characters and giving us a reason to care about them. And when I thought about it, I realized that part of this is they stuck to 4. The fourth is Obi-Wan Kenobi, and then he fades out, and Darth Vader kind of rises as a character that we come to care about in that original trilogy. But basically, screen time-wise, they only ever are involved in the character development of 4 characters at a time. And that gives, the 2 hours that you have, it gives you a lot of time to develop those people so the audience can come to care about them. And 1, 2, and 3 just completely fall down on that. But certainly in this series, the problem they've had is they've tried to keep the old ones and then add new ones. So now you got 7 to 8 characters in the same basic amount of time that you're trying to get the audience to care about. Well, it doesn't give anybody enough screen time or interaction for us to care about their story or to become involved in them. My argument to the creative directors would have been, look, I don't know why you're trying to throw away the older characters, but if you are, write them all out in the first one. I mean, they should have all been written out in The Force Awakens because you don't have enough screen time to tell 8 people's stories. I think the key is to keep it to around 3 or 4. So the audience will care about those 3 or 4. And because they're trying to keep the others around too long, and they're introducing all these other characters, is just not enough screen time for everyone. So that's one of the problems why it's not working. And my other question is why do we need new droids? They've got this new BB droid, right, who's round, and we're supposed to care about him. But what's wrong with C-3PO and R2-D2? I mean, they're eternal. They have been in all the movies. They don't grow old. They've always created this sort of glue throughout everything. They've been in all the comic books. They were in the cartoons as well. And they're a staple. And why throw that out? And it goes to my point about every element of Star Wars is being rejected in these films. And I don't know why we need new droids when everybody loves the old ones and they aren't aging out. You don't have, older actors that you have to deal with who might die off. So you can keep these characters forever, and they're not. And that doesn't make any sense to me, except is if you just don't like the franchise and you want to push all the old stuff out. I really think that what you're dealing with in the creative teams that are looking at these films are people who are looking at the Star Wars franchise and saying, you know what, it makes a lot of money, and so we want to make money, but it's got a lot of old elements to it. It's a little too chauvinist, it's not feminist enough, it's not diverse enough, and, it's got these kind of old ideas about what makes us human and family and loyalty, and we need to blow all that up. There's a lot of patriarchy in there, and we need to bring all of these kind of new wave social justice warrior ideas in. And you can see that if you look for it, it's all in there. That it's not enough, as most movies do, that they're trying to insert social justice warrior stuff, but they go out of their way to crap on, to spit on. Literally, they have characters with dialogues who are telling you that the things you loved about Star Wars are crap. I mean, again, I'm not going to do too many spoilers here, but there's a moment where something that would be very anti-Jedi is about to happen, and Luke kind of hesitates, and there's a very famous Jedi in the picture who basically says, no, go ahead and do it. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. None of it matters. None of this Jedi history matters. Right, so I mean, it's not just enough that they're inserting all this social justice warrior themes that these new things they want you to believe, but they actually go out of their way to tell you the old stuff is crap. I mean, they have the Kylo Ren character actively says you have to kill the past. You have to kill the past and be done with it, which is what these movies are trying to tell you. Is they're trying to sweep away all the old Jedi stuff and tell you that there's just this new world with a new set of principles. Well, other than that, you can trick a lot of people to come in because they're looking for the old stuff, and that's not what you're giving them, but you got their money anyway. The whole point of continuing a franchise is, it would be like making a Harry Potter movie and saying, yeah, no, this Harry Potter stuff is all a bunch of crap. Let me tell you this new world. I didn't pay money based on my love of Harry Potter to come in and watch you give me something different. When when you're making a franchise film, part of what people want is to have all the bells rung of the things they love about the franchise. And this movie actively doesn't want to do it. You can feel it in every scene that they basically we just want your money. We don't actually want to give you the Star Wars stuff you love. So they're willing to give you, they do the action a lot better. A lot of the kind of nuts and bolts stuff, the mechanics are done very well. It looks good and the action sequences are pretty good. But the story's kind of, And, if you turn your brain on for a moment and ask yourself, what's the subtext here? It's not pleasant. It's not pleasant at all. Another problem, they push animal rights stuff. And I was telling a friend the other day that it's I kind of expect there to be an animal rights moment in Hollywood films. You sort of have to tolerate that. But, of course, this movie does it more than once. When it happens once, I was I just kind of rolled my eyes okay, they're going to do an animal rights thing. But then 20 minutes later, we get it again. Totally different scene, totally different issue, but more animal rights stuff. So it's okay, it's hard to not notice it at that point that they're going to push animal rights stuff, the military-industrial complex, class struggle. It's all just on the nose and in your face in the movie. The original was filled with colorful characters who simply provided atmosphere to sort of enrich this universe and give you a sense that this whole place exists. It had lots of people who were not involved in the fight between the Skywalkers and the Siths, right? There were bounty hunters, there were smugglers, there were farmers on Tatooine, there was, if you think about Calrissian's city, there were all those people there that lived in that cloud city, and they weren't involved in the fight. They were just living their lives and doing their thing, right? Even the Ewoks, who get kind of pulled into it, when we first meet them, they're just going about their business, doing their own thing. They don't really care either. This trilogy doesn't have a lot of that. Everybody in this trilogy is involved in this fight in one way or another, right? So it's all in the struggle, nothing outside of the struggle. And it's too bad, because I think part of what just sort of gives the world atmosphere and makes it seem real is that you get this sense that a lot of people are just sort of doing their own thing. I noticed some other critics basically saying that it was lousy storytelling, recycled ideas, lifeless characterizations, all true. Someone said, why was every serious moment broken up by a comedy moment akin to self-parody? I agree with that statement. Totally. Look, I feel sorry for the children who are at the mercy of these content providers, who feel that all these old stories and myths and archetypes are all just too Western, too white, too chauvinistic. Because the progressive pablum that they're peddling to these kids is useless to them. There were things and themes in Star Wars that are eternal. You can find in stories that go back hundreds, thousands of years. And that's why even 30 or 40 years later, we find ourselves rewatching those movies and enjoying them, because they ping something very primal in us. These movies don't do that. And you are not going to see that same kind of love carry forward decade after decade. They'll make money now, but these films are not going to be as important to young children seeing them right now as those originals were to some of us. So this weekend is Christmas. Merry Christmas to all of our listeners. Merry Christmas, Doris.
So
you're going to be making dinner.
I am.
So Doris doesn't just make dinner. She makes a spread. There are lots of leftovers. This is what Thanksgiving was like. So I thought it would be interesting for you all to hear the menu that she intends for our Sunday night dinner. Doris?
Well, first I'm going to start with an appetizer of honey spiced hazelnuts, or filberts to people that live in the Northwest. Then we'll be sitting down to a fresh fruit compote, honey baked ham and turkey breast. I'll add in sweet potatoes and mashed potatoes and gravy. And I won't forget the green beans, cranberry sauce, and black olives. After we've rested a couple of hours, we'll finish up with some apple pie and peppermint hot chocolate.
She'll do all of this, folks. This isn't coming from the store. I'm looking forward to it. Yum. That's about all the time that we have, folks. Merry Christmas to you, and remember that this show and all of the previous shows can be found on your favorite podcasting apps: iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Pocket Cast, and YouTube. This is a labor of love, but we do need to grow, so I am hoping that you will make it your mission to just introduce one other person, one other Trump supporter to this podcast so that we can grow our audience. Trump supporters, you are not alone. Goodbye, Doris.
Goodbye, Matt.